Hey, what's up guys? In this video, we are going to look at the most important camera settings for cinematic videos. For you to capture good looking cinematic videos, you need to know how to set up your camera properly. And the most important camera settings that you must know as a videographer are exposure, resolution, frame rate, white balance, picture style, codecs, bitrates, and video formats. Before I go into details, I just want to let you know that this is the only chapter in this whole course that has got some sort of theory. And if you want to skip this chapter, you might as well skip the rest of other chapters, as well as your filmmaking career also skip it. Because there will be no use, you still create boring videos without these settings. Alright, let's begin with exposure. Exposure is the amount of light that is allowed to hit the sensor of your camera. When you let in too much light, your image will look too bright. This is called overexposed image. And if you let in too little light in your camera, your image will look too dark. This is called an underexposed image. So you need to find the right balance to make sure that your image is not too bright or too dark. Now, the three settings which control the amount of light that enters through the camera are aperture or iris, ISO or gain on some camera, then we have shutter speed. For your image to be properly exposed, you have to find the right balance between the aperture, ISO, and shutter speed. Now let's look at the aperture or iris. This is the opening and closing of the iris in the lens, allowing more or less light to enter in the camera. It can be electronically or manually opened depending on the lens that is attached to your camera. The aperture is often expressed as an f number such as f1.2, f1.4, f2.8, and so on. When your aperture number is high, like f22, your image will look dark. And if your aperture number is low, like f1.2, your image will look bright. The aperture also affects depth of field, which is the amount of background blur. So at low aperture like f1.2 or f1.8, there is shallow depth of field. This is when your subject is in focus and the background is blurred. And if your aperture is high like at f22, everything in your image will be in focus, creating a greater depth of field. If you are a person like myself who likes the shallow depth of field, then invest in lenses that have got low aperture numbers like f1.2, f1.4, or f1.8, and so on. This will also help to shoot in low light conditions, especially on small sensor cameras like the Lumix GH5, which I'm filming on right now. Next, let's look at the ISO. The ISO, or gain in some cameras, is the sensitivity of the sensor of your camera to light. A lower ISO number means your camera will be less sensitive to light, causing your image to look dark. And higher ISO number means your camera will be more sensitive to light, causing the image to be bright. ISO also affects picture quality. A low ISO number results in a clean, high-quality image, and a higher ISO number results in a grainy, low-quality image. Each camera has its own native base ISO. Native base ISO is more like the high point of ISO where the noise in your camera is the least. For example, my Lumix GH5 has its native base ISO 400. This means between 0 and 400 ISO, I can get a clean, high-quality image. But if I start to push the ISO from 400 and above, the image will begin to have noise, which is almost always never wanted in videos. You can find the native base ISO of your camera by just simply asking Google or taking your camera to a slightly darker room and start pushing the ISO up until you begin to see noise. And always shoot within the ISO where the camera doesn't appear to have noise on your image. Alright, number 3, let's talk about the shutter speed real quickly. Shutter speed is exactly what it sounds like. It is the speed at which the shutter in the camera opens and closes. The higher the shutter speed number, the faster the shutter speed opens and closes, allowing less light to enter in the camera. This will make your image dark. And the lower the shutter speed number, the slower the shutter opens and closes, allowing more light to enter in the camera. This will cause your image very bright. Shutter speed also affects motion blur. Hey, motion blur. The lower the shutter speed number, for example, 1/25th of a second, look at how much motion blur we have in this image. But if we shoot at a higher shutter speed, for example, 1,000th of a second, look at how sharp the image looks now. If we take these videos and put them side by side, you can see the difference when we pause them. Too much motion blur is not good in a video, and a video without motion blur doesn't look cinematic and natural. Because in reality, if you wave your hand in front of your eyes, you will notice there is some motion. This is called natural motion blur. There is a rule to achieve natural motion blur in videos. The rule is to set your shutter speed twice the frame rate. For example, if you are shooting at 24 frames per second, your shutter speed must be set at 1/48th of a second or to the nearest like 1/50th of a second, especially on most DSLR cameras. And if your frame rate is 60 frames per second, your shutter speed must be set at 1/20th of a second. But there are times when I break this rule. For example, if I'm shooting a video with an intention to freeze some pictures from it, I'll set my shutter speed to a higher number like 1/500th of a second so that when I pause the video, it will not have motion blur. So I'll have cleaner pictures. So those were like the tips of how to expose your images correctly. But in the next video, let's look at some tools that can help us to expose our videos correctly. I'm so excited for this one, and don't skip it because it's very important. I'll see you in the next video. This is it. Peace. Hey, what's up guys? In this video, I'm gonna go over some tools that can help us to nail exposure. So even though you may know how to adjust aperture, ISO, and shutter speed correctly, you may still find it difficult to nail exposure correctly because most camera screens are not accurate. I'm talking about LCD screens. They're not accurate. You can look at your screen like this, thinking that you have adjusted your exposure correctly, but when you go in the editing, it is something else. Sometimes your camera monitor may be too bright. So when we set exposure looking at the monitor, we may think it looks fine, but when we take that footage to the computer, it looks dark. For example, my Lumix GH2 has the worst screen monitor ever. It's low resolution and the colors are not accurate and it's very small. But many tools can help us nail exposure all the time. These tools are histogram, zebra stripes, waveform, external monitor, and ND filters. At least these are the ones that I use all the time. Some cameras may have all these tools built in them, like my Lumix GH5, but others may have one or two, and yet others nothing at all. Now check your camera and see which exposure tools are there, and let's begin. Let me start with the histogram. This is the go-to tool for most videographers, including myself. It has a graph that shows how your image is exposed. If your image is too dark, you will see this graph shifts to the left, meaning your image is underexposed. And if your image is too bright, the graph will move towards the right, telling you that your image is overexposed. So to be sure that you have the correct exposure, make sure the graph is evenly spread from the middle. With my Lumix GH5, the graph will be yellow if the image is not correctly exposed. And when it is exposed properly, it turns white. Then I know this is the correct exposure. Next, let's move on to the zebra stripes. This is my method of finding the correct exposure. This tool will show you striped zebra lines on the part of your image which is overexposed. So if you look at this image, all these areas which have zebra lines are overexposed. If I begin to lower my exposure, these zebra lines will begin to disappear, especially on the forehead here of my subject, until it is perfect. Even though you can still see some zebra lines over the lights here, it is still fine because the lights are naturally bright. But for the forehead and other parts of my main subject or my dominant subject, I need to make sure that there is no zebra lines showing there because I don't want the skin tones to be exposed, to be overexposed and stuff like that. In other cameras like my Lumix GH5, you can even select the percentage at which you want to start seeing the zebra lines in your image. Alright, let's move on to the next exposure tool, which is the waveform. The waveform works more like the histogram with even more data. Not only does it tell you how much of your image is underexposed, it will also show you specific exposure of different areas across your image from right to left. If your image is overexposed, you'll see this graph will shift up. And if your image is underexposed, the graph will shift down. For example, if you look at this image, right here and there, we have these bright lights. And on the graph, you can see exactly where those lights are because the information along those bright areas is way up on the graph. Next is the external monitors. Some cameras may have all these tools inbuilt like my Lumix GH5, while others may have only one or two, but others yet nothing at all. That's where external monitors come in. Almost all external monitors have one of these tools. So you can just put an external monitor on your camera if it doesn't have any of these exposure tools. The other advantage of external monitors is they are usually bigger in size than the actual camera monitor. Therefore, you can see things much better, much bigger, and more accurately. And lastly, I want to talk about ND filters. If you are shooting in broad daylight, exposure might be a big problem, especially if you want to maintain a certain style or look. For example, if you want to have a shallow depth of field, it means the aperture number should be very low, like f1.2 or f1.8. which will make your image overexposed. And if you increase your shutter speed to reduce the light, your image will look sharp without motion blur. Therefore, the best solution is to use ND filters or neutral density filters. This is a filter that you place in front of your camera to block the amount of light making its way to the camera. It's more like sunglasses for your camera. Alright guys, those are some of the exposure tools that can help you to nail exposure of your image all the time. I'll catch you in the next video. This is it. Peace. Next is frame rates. Let's talk about frame rates. I'm sure you have heard things like 24 frames per second, 25 frames per second, 60 frames per second, and so on. But what are they? Let me explain. A digital video is made up of hundreds of still images played in a sequence. These still images are called frames. So frame rates refers to how many still images are packed in each second. If you hear someone saying 24 frames per second, they mean 24 still images played in a second to form motion, which we call videos. The most common frame rates are 24 frames per second, 25 frames per second, 30 frames per second, 48 frames per second, 50 frames per second, and 60 frames per second. It is very important to know what frame rate you are shooting your video in, because frame rates have got different looks. For example, 24 frames per second has a natural motion blur. That is the frame rate used even in Hollywood movies. It makes videos look cinematic and natural. Whilst 25 and 30 frames per second look like home videos. They are sharp and not much motion blur. TV shows, broadcasters, and news channels make their videos in these frame rates. On the other hand, 48, 50, and 60 frames per second are used to create slow motion videos, especially when you're using your DSLR camera. If you're shooting your video at a higher frame rate like 50 frames per second, in post-production, you can interpret that footage, converting it from 50 frames per second to 24 frames per second, giving you this smooth slow motion video. But if you are shooting at 24 or 25 frames per second, and then make the video slow in post, your slow motion video won't be very smooth. It will look very choppy and unpleasant. The same thing will happen if you shoot your video at 50 frames per second and edit it in a timeline of 24 frames per second without converting it. It will look very choppy because the video has to cut some of those extra frames, because remember now you are editing in 24 frames per second sequence. So when I'm filming a video, for example, a music video, for my performance clips, I shoot at 24 frames per second, and all the other clips that I intend to put in slow motion, these could be B-roll clips. I shoot at 60 frames per second and convert them to 24 frames per second in post to create this smooth slow motion video. Since we are talking about cinematic filmmaking, in conclusion, if you want your videos to look cinematic, shoot at 24 frames per second. If you want your videos to look like a home video or broadcast video, if you are doing something for a broadcasting studio, shoot at 25 or 30 frames per second. And if you want to slow down your video in post to create a smooth slow motion, shoot at 50 or 60 frames per second or higher. So what you need to do is to check the highest and lowest frame rate your camera can shoot, and make sure you use correct frame rates for different types of videos. Hey, what's up guys? In this video, let's understand video resolution. Video resolution is the number of pixels contained in each frame. Pixels are the smallest square boxes that contain information about an image. So if I zoom on this picture, you will notice the small square boxes. These are called pixels. Now, the lower the number of pixels in the image, the lower the resolution of that image. And the higher the number of pixels in an image, the higher the resolutions. Pixels are arranged in horizontal and vertical positions. So resolution also determines the dimensions or the size of the video in width and height. So we had standard definition video, which was 480 by 640 back in the days. Then we have Half HD, which has a resolution of 720 by 1280. And then we have Full HD, which has a resolution of 1920 by 1080, which is the resolution that you are watching this video right now. Then we have 4K resolution, which is 4096 by 2160, and 5K, 6K, 8K, and now we even have 12K. So you also have to understand the resolution that you are filming in. Now, the most question that I get asked a lot by my students is, what resolution should I use for my videos? Now, if you are wondering what resolution you must use for your videos, of all the resolutions which are available right now, as of the year 2022, only 3 resolutions are standard and popular, which is 720 by 1080, that is half HD, and Full HD at 1920 by 1080. Then we have 4K and Ultra HD, 4K, which is 4096 by 2160, and Ultra HD, which is 3840 by 2160. So these are the most standard resolutions that we have now. Though half HD 720 by 1280 is still being used, it has become outdated, so I wouldn't advise you to shoot your videos in half HD. It has a low resolution. 1080p or Full HD is the current standard resolution for most videos right now. It has a high resolution and the picture quality is high too. So if you have a camera that can shoot in Full HD 1920 by 1080, you are good. 4K, on the other hand, is becoming the new standard. It is almost 50-50 with 1080p in terms of demand. It has a higher resolution and better picture quality more than 1080p video. For this reason, I shoot all my videos in 4K because 4K is more like a future-proof. By the time 4K becomes standard, I already have videos that were shot in 4K before it was standard. So it's more like a future-proof. And if you can get a camera that can shoot in 4K, I highly recommend that. Even though I still export most of my videos in Full HD, videos that are shot in 4K and exported in HD look very crispy and sharp than a video that is recorded in Full HD and exported in Full HD. The other advantage of 4K is that if I shoot my videos in 4K and edit in an HD timeline, I can digitally zoom and reframe my videos without losing quality. It gives a lot of flexibility in editing. So I will highly recommend that you shoot all your videos in 4K, but if Full HD is all you can afford, it is still very much okay. Alright guys, moving on to white balance. White balance is a setting in your camera which allows you to adjust colors to match the color of the light source so that white objects appear white. If you don't adjust your white balance according to the light source that is available in the situation where you are shooting, your whites might look too warm or too cold, which will affect the rest of the colors in your video. Now, setting up the white balance in your camera is very easy. If you go to the white balance setting on your camera, you'll see several white balance controls. Most DSLR cameras have got some presets and the layout is almost always the same. On my Lumix GH5, the first one is auto white balance. If you select this option or this setting, the camera will automatically analyze the scene for you and set the white balance automatically. Sometimes it might do a good job, but sometimes it might set the wrong white balance. The worst is it can set the white balance correctly at the beginning of your shoot, but whilst you are filming, it might change the white balance automatically. So I don't recommend using auto white balance at all. Moving away from auto white balance, on the right, you will see some presets which you can use. For example, if you are shooting outside during daylight, you can set your white balance to a daylight preset. If it is cloudy, you can put on a cloudy preset and so on according to the presets in your camera. This process may do an almost accurate white balance in some scenarios. The advantage of using white balance preset is that it will maintain the same balance whether it is correct or not, unlike auto white balance that may change whilst you are shooting. However, it is also not reliable because whilst you are filming, the weather may change and it will still continue maintaining the same preset. So I don't recommend white balance presets either. The correct way to set your white balance is manually. You have to learn how to use or how to set your white balance manually. Let me show you. On my Lumix GH5, it is very easy. There are 2 sets of manual white balance controls. The first set is where you just point your camera to anything which is white in your scene and press the shutter button and it will set the white balance automatically. Now, this feature might not be available in your camera, but the one which is in every camera is Kelvin adjustment, which is written with K. The K stands for Kelvin, which is the unit used to measure temperature. Because when we are adjusting the white balance, It is really the temperature that we are adjusting. All our light sources have got a certain temperature which is measured in the units of Kelvin on a scale of 1000 to 10,000. This scale represents temperature from dawn to sunset during the day. So if you are shooting during the middle of the day, your temperature should be around the middle of the scale, which is between 5000 and 5500 Kelvin. So you set your white balance within that value. During midday, I normally set my white balance to around 5400. As the sun begins to set, the colors begin to be warmer until the golden hour when it is orangish. So you set your white balance in the opposite scale, which is about 2000 to 3000 Kelvin at golden hour. And after the sunset, the temperature becomes cooler. Everything looks blue. So you set your white balance to a warmer value between 8000 and 10,000 Kelvin. When you are shooting indoors, it depends what kind of lights are being used to light the room. If it is home tungsten lights, you can set your white balance between 2500 and 2900 Kelvin. If it is daylight, you can set your white balance to around 5500 Kelvin. If it is fluorescent lighting, you can set your white balance between 3200 and 7500 Kelvin. The idea of how white balance works is when it is too cold, the whites in your image look blue, so you raise the temperature to make them white. When it is too warm at golden hour, the whites in your image look orange, so you drop the temperature to the cold side to make them pure white. However, for me, who shoots music videos, sometimes I can put colored lights in the scene. For example, blue, so that everything looks blue according to the concept. This will make whites in the scene look blue as well. So if I adjust my white balance so that whites look white, I'm destroying the concept. So what I usually do in almost all scenarios when I'm adjusting white balance, I normally set my white balance according to what my eyes can see naturally. If I'm shooting at golden hour, naturally the whites will look orangish according to my eyes, naturally. And I'll set my white balance according to what my eyes can see. I hope you get the idea. Alright, let's move on now to picture styles. Picture style is a function in your camera that enables you to adjust the color, tone, contrast, and sharpness of your video according to your liking. Every camera comes preloaded with different picture styles that will give you a certain look or a particular look. On my Lumix GH5, these are portrait, scenery, L monochrome D, L monochrome, then we have monochrome, natural, vivid, standard, Vlog L like 709, Cine like V, Cine like D. Some picture styles like Cine like V are so vibrant and contrasty, so they don't really give you so much room when it comes to color grading, as so much information is already baked inside the image. Whilst some picture styles like natural picture style are somewhere in the middle. They are not so vibrant and contrasty, and they are not too flat. So they give you some room to play around with a few things when it comes to color grading. Then we have flat picture styles like Vlog L, C-Log, or S-Log in any camera that you are using, which will give you all the freedom when it comes to color grading. Lastly, we have a custom style in almost every camera that you can make for yourself to come up with a look that you desire, right? When you get into the custom picture style, the Lumix GH5 has 5 adjustable sliders. It has the contrast, sharpness, noise reduction, saturation, and hue. Right. Contrast controls how flat or contrast your image is. Sharpness controls how soft or detailed your image is. Noise reduction controls how smooth or grainy your image is. Then you have saturation, which controls how vibrant your colors are. And then hue controls the tint of your video. Depending on what you want to do or how you want your video to look, you should choose a picture style that will give you that kind of a freedom. Another very important issue to be aware of when choosing a picture style is the color depth of your camera. You should know if your camera shoots in 8-bit, 10-bit, or 12-bit color depth. Bit depth refers to the number of bits used to define red, green, or blue channels in the image. If you shoot on an 8-bit camera, don't use a flat picture style like Vlog L, S-Log, or C-Log with an intention to color grade the footage later in the post, because 8-bit footage doesn't have enough color information for heavy color grading. Though sometimes I do it, but if you are starting out, it will really give you so much problem. You can shoot using a standard or natural picture style so that you already have enough color information baked in your image for color grading, so that color grading, it will be just an easy go. Most of the time I shoot in Vlog L, a very flat picture style, so that I can color grade my footage later, especially when I'm shooting music videos, because my camera is able to shoot in 10-bit color depth. But for other projects like wedding videos, I just use either natural or standard styles because they are natural stories and I always want them to look as natural as possible. And I just really don't have so much time to color grade the whole 5-hour wedding video ceremony. However, there are times when I create my own custom picture styles, like for this video that I shot for Nox featuring DJ Tira. For music videos, on my Lumix GH5, here is how I customize my picture style. Contrast, I normally take it all the way to -5 to optimize my camera's ability to capture both highlights and shadows. Then sharpness, I take it to -2. Noise reduction, I take it to -2. Saturation, I also usually take it to -2. Then hue, I always leave it at 0. Alright guys, depending on what kind of a camera you are using, be careful when you're choosing a picture style because it will determine the look of your video. Play around with different picture styles that are available in your camera and see what they can do. Otherwise, I'll see you in the next video. Alright, now let's look at codecs, bitrates, and formats. Another important setting in your camera is to know which codec or format your camera is recording your video in. When you go to your camera settings, under record formats, you will see different formats. In my camera, these are AVCHD, MP4, MP4 HEVC, MP4 LPCM, and MOV. Each of these formats have different video quality. The one I use 95% of the time is MOV. You should check your camera and see the highest format it can record. Some cameras under the record format use codecs like ProRes, H.264, or HEVC, just to mention a few. Now, a codec is just a compression and a decompression of a digital video. It's more like an encoder. A codec can either be lossy or lossless. Lossy codecs compress the video so much to make the file smaller, while lossless codecs do not compress the videos so much. So they are usually very big. Just be aware of that. I usually record a few clips using different formats and different codecs just so that I can see which one has the highest quality and which one has the lowest quality. Another honorable mention is the bitrate, which is the amount of data that is being encoded per second in a video. Bitrate also determines how big the video will be and what quality of that video. If the video has a lower bitrate like 2 megabits per second, that video will be very small in size and the quality will be poor. But if the bitrate is higher, the video will have a larger file size and the quality will be excellent. Lossless codecs and high bitrate make your video files very big and very difficult for editing unless you have a high-end computer. In conclusion, be aware when deciding which codec you want to shoot your video in and which bitrate, because this will affect the file size, the picture quality, or the editing flow. So just make sure you choose something that is in between, not too high bitrate, favorable codecs, at the same time giving you a good video quality, and your computer can edit the video without any problems.